Ellen Monroe stepped off the westbound train at Dusty Creek, Kansas, with a carpetbag in one hand, a broken heart in her chest, and the absolute iron determination never to cry over Thomas Hale again. The platform was nothing like Philadelphia. There was no polished marble underfoot, no gas lamps lined up in elegant rows, no gentlemen tipping their hats to ladies in silk. Instead, the platform was raw lumber that groaned under her boots. The air smelled of horse and iron, and something sun-baked she could not quite name, and every soul on that platform seemed to be moving with a purpose so sharp it left no room for sentiment. Ellen liked that immediately. Sentiment was what had gotten her into trouble in the first place. She was 24 years old, brown-haired and hazel-eyed, and she had spent 3 years believing that Thomas Hale, the son of a Philadelphia shipping merchant, was going to make her his wife. He had let her believe it. He had courted her with flowers and piano recitals and long walks through the park, and then on a Tuesday in March of 1882, he had married a banker's daughter from Boston, while Ellen sat at home wondering why he had not come to call in 2 weeks. She had heard about it from her neighbor, Mrs. Prentice, who delivered the news with the particular kind of cheerful sorrow that truly happy married women reserve for unmarried ones. Ellen had thanked her, gone inside, packed a bag, written a letter to her older brother James in Denver explaining that she was coming west to teach school, and had not looked back once. That had been 11 days ago. Now she stood in the dry heat of June in Dusty Creek, Kansas, which was a town of perhaps 300 souls situated on the edge of the prairie like a question mark at the end of a long, flat sentence, and she breathed the hot wind off the grass and thought that it was actually beautiful in a spare, unadorned way that Thomas Hale would never have appreciated. She picked up her carpetbag and walked toward the single street. The town consisted of a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon called the Red Horn, a livery stable, a church with a listing steeple, a barber, a small hotel called the Prairie House, and a scattering of homes set back from the road behind dry-grass yards. There was a schoolhouse at the far end, she was told, that had been without a teacher for 4 months after the previous one had gotten married and moved to Wichita. Ellen had written ahead to the town alderman, a man named Herbert Cook, who met her on the street with a handshake firm enough to rattle her teeth. "Miss Monroe," he said, "you are a welcome sight. The children have been running roughshod over Mrs. Tanner's nerves since March, and she is at the end of her rope." "I am very glad to be here," Ellen said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Herbert Cook arranged for her to stay at the Prairie House until more suitable accommodations could be found, and he showed her the schoolhouse, which was a single room with 8 rows of desks, a chalkboard, a wood stove, and windows that let in long bands of afternoon light that fell across the floor in gold rectangles. Ellen walked the room slowly, dragging her fingertips along the desktops, and felt something loosen in her chest. This was real. This was hers. This had nothing to do with Thomas Hale. She started school 3 days later with 21 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, and by the end of the first week she had established both her authority and her warmth in equal measure, which was the only way to survive in a frontier schoolroom. The children were rough-edged and quick. Some of them had never seen a proper book before, and almost all of them were hungry to learn in a way that city children, accustomed to comfort, sometimes were not. It was during the second week that she first heard the name Nathan Atkins. She heard it from one of her students, a gap-toothed 10-year-old named Billy Cook, nephew of the alderman, who arrived on a Monday morning with a cut on his chin and a story burning to get out of him. "My pa says Mr. Atkins stopped the Garner brothers from burning down the Hendersons' fence line," Billy announced during the reading lesson, apparently unable to contain the information 1 second longer. Ellen kept her eyes on the McGuffey reader in her hand. "Billy, we are in the middle of a lesson." "Yes, ma'am, but he stopped 2 of them by himself. He rode right up between the fire and the Hendersons' barn." "That will keep for recess," Ellen said, but she was listening. She heard about Nathan Atkins twice more before she actually saw him. She heard from Margaret Tanner, the woman who had been minding the children before Ellen arrived, that he was the best cattleman in the county and ran a spread of about 400 acres north of town called the Atkins Ranch, which he had built from nothing over 6 years. She heard from the woman who ran the hotel, a stout widow named Clara Briggs, that he was a quiet man, not given to boasting, which in her opinion put him above most men she had encountered. Clara Briggs said this while setting a plate of cornbread in front of Ellen, and she said it with the particular tone of a woman who would like to say more but is refraining out of respect for the natural order of things. Ellen was not interested. She was not interested in any man. She had come west to do her job and heal in peace, and she was doing both of those things rather well, thank you. The prairie in the morning was extraordinary, all that grass going silver in the early light, and she had taken to rising before sunrise just to stand on the hotel porch and watch it. She was sleeping better than she had in months. Her color was coming back. She first saw Nathan Atkins on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of June. She was coming out of the general store with a box of chalk and a new map of the United States she had ordered from the catalog, and he was tying his horse to the hitching post out front. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a plain canvas shirt and worn leather vest, with dust on his boots and a hat pulled low against the midday sun. He was perhaps 30 years old, dark-haired and brown from working outdoors, with a jaw that suggested he did not change his mind often and hands that suggested he worked hard for what he kept. He held the door for her as she came out, stepping back and pulling the door wide without making a production of it, and he looked at her with dark eyes that were direct but not impolite. "Ma'am," he said. "Thank you," she said, and that was the whole of it. She walked back to the schoolhouse carrying her chalk and her map, and she did not think about Nathan Atkins again until that evening when Clara Briggs mentioned at supper that the man who had held the door for her was indeed Nathan Atkins, because Clara Briggs apparently saw everything that happened on that street and considered it her personal duty to provide context. "He's a good man," Clara said, in a tone that was almost a warning. "I am sure he is," Ellen said pleasantly, and ate her cornbread. The incident that changed things happened on a Saturday in late June. Ellen had ridden borrowed horse from the livery out along the eastern creek to do some sketching, which she had taken up as a hobby since arriving, finding that the landscape demanded to be recorded in some way. She had learned to ride in Philadelphia well enough to manage, and the horse, an aging bay mare named Biscuit who had no opinions about anything, suited her temperament perfectly. She had been out perhaps 2 hours when the sky went strange. She had not been in Kansas long enough to read the sky the way people born to the prairie read it, and she looked up at the greenish light spreading from the northwest with honest puzzlement rather than the alarm she should have felt. It was only when the wind stopped entirely, completely and suddenly, as if someone had shut a window on the world, that something cold moved through her. She gathered her sketchbook and turned Biscuit toward town, but the horse had already decided on this course of action without her input and was moving at a nervous trot. Ellen could see the cloud now, a great dark shelf of it rolling toward her with a deliberate, terrible slowness that was somehow more frightening than speed, and beneath it the air was the color of old brass. She urged Biscuit to a gallop. The horse needed no urging. They were perhaps a mile from town when the hail started, small at first and then suddenly the size of hickory nuts, and Biscuit shied hard to the left and Ellen lost a stirrup and nearly went off. She recovered herself, leaning low over the horse's neck, her sketchbook gone somewhere behind her, the hail stinging her arms and the back of her neck. She nearly ran into the rider coming toward her at a flat-out gallop. He pulled his horse to a sliding stop, the animal's haunches nearly touching the ground, and the horse was a big black gelding and the man on it was Nathan Atkins. He took in the situation in about 1 second. "This way," he shouted over the rising wind. "There's a creek bank. Come on." He turned and she followed because there was nothing else sensible to do. He led her perhaps 200 yards to where the creek cut a deep channel into the earth, and there was an overhang of clay and rock that formed a rough shelter maybe 5 feet high and 10 feet wide. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, took both sets of reins, and pulled both horses under the overhang while Ellen dropped down beside him. The storm hit like a wall. The hail came down in sheets, hammering the ground and the creek bank, and the thunder was so continuous it stopped being individual sounds and became a constant pressure in the chest. Ellen pressed herself back against the clay bank and watched the prairie disappear behind a curtain of ice and rain and wind, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was exhilarated. Nathan stood beside the horses with a hand on each neck, keeping them steady. He glanced at her once, checking that she was all right, and she gave him a single firm nod that she hoped communicated that she was not about to have hysterics, because she was not. They stood in that close space for perhaps 30 minutes while the storm raged. The horses settled after a few minutes, trusting him. Ellen watched his hands on their necks, the way he moved with them rather than against them, and she thought that you could tell a great deal about a man by the way he handled an animal that was afraid. When the storm began to ease, he turned to her. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Thank you. I did not read the sky correctly." "It takes time out here," he said without judgment. "The sky moves differently than it does back east. You know I am from back east." "Miss Monroe," he said, and there was the faintest trace of something almost amused in his voice. "There are 300 people in this town." "Of course," she said, and felt the color rise in her face. He helped her back onto Biscuit when the hail had stopped, and they rode back to town through the wet, steaming grass with the sky already clearing to the west in bands of extraordinary orange and gold. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settles between two people who have just been through something together and do not need to make words out of it immediately. At the livery, he took Biscuit's reins from her and walked the horse inside without being asked. "I can do that," Ellen said. "I know you can," he said. "But Charlie is still cleaning up from the storm and the horse needs to be checked for hail hits." "Let me." She waited. He came back in 4 minutes. "She is fine," he said. "A couple of soft spots on her rump, but nothing that will bother her." "Thank you," Ellen said. "Mr. Atkins, is it?" "It is," he said. "And you are Miss Monroe, the school teacher." "I am," she said. They looked at each other for a moment in the late afternoon light, with the storms wet still in the air and the whole prairie gleaming around them, and something passed between them that was not yet a thing you could name but was definitely something. "Well," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Good evening, Miss Monroe." "Good evening, Mr. Atkins," she said. She walked back to the prairie house with her wet hair coming loose from its pins and mud on her boots and no sketchbook, and she was smiling, which she noticed only when Clara Briggs commented on it at supper. "Good ride?" Clara asked. "Eventful," Ellen said, and helped herself to a second piece of cornbread. The children had their end-of-June examination on a Friday, and Ellen was pleased with the results. 7 of them could read passages they had not seen before. 3, who had arrived unable to write more than their names, could now produce complete sentences. A boy named Cole Harker, who was 14, and had told her on the first day that he did not see the point in school because he was going to work cattle, had quietly developed a passion for geography that Ellen suspected was going to alter the course of his life whether he liked it or not. She had also, in the course of that month, settled into the town more than she had expected. She had made a genuine friend in Clara Briggs, whose no-nonsense warmth was exactly what Ellen needed, and whose cornbread was better than anything she had ever eaten in Philadelphia. She had begun attending the Sunday services at the Listing Steeple Church, not because she was especially devout, but because it was where the community gathered and gathered honestly, without the social performances she had found exhausting in Philadelphia. She had taken 3 more rides on Biscuit, each time watching the sky with much greater attention. She saw Nathan Atkins perhaps twice a week, in the way that you see people in a small town, across the street, or in the general store, or at Sunday service, where he sat 3 pews behind her and to the left. They nodded to each other. Once he stopped her on the street to tell her that her student Billy Cook had found a lost calf on the North Road and returned it to the Hendersons' property without being asked, and that he thought she ought to know since she probably had something to do with the boy's character. Ellen had been so surprised by this that she had said, "That is very kind of you to tell me," in a voice slightly warmer than she had intended, and he had nodded and gone on his way, and she had stood there in the sun for a moment feeling something she could not quite account for. It was Clara Briggs, of course, who brought matters to a head, because Clara Briggs had the instincts of a general and the patience of a chess player. "Nathan Atkins asked Herbert Cook if you might want to see the ranch," Clara said one evening in July, setting down the coffee pot with deliberate casualness. Ellen looked up from the book she was reading. "He did not ask me himself," she said. "He is not that kind of man," Clara said. "He asks correctly. He wanted to make sure it would be proper." Ellen set down the book. "It is very considerate of him," she said carefully. "But I am not looking for I did not come here for. You came here to forget someone," Clara said. "I know. You have been here long enough that most of the forgetting is done, and what is left will not go faster by keeping yourself at a distance from every good thing." Ellen looked at the woman for a long moment. Clara Briggs returned the look with the particular combination of compassion and absolute refusal to be deflected that characterized her approach to most things. "One visit to the ranch," Ellen said finally, "as a matter of general interest in the surrounding area." "Of course," said Clara with great serenity. Nathan Atkins came to the Prairie House on a Sunday after church, hat in hand, and asked if she would like to ride out to the property. He had brought a second horse, a gentle gray mare named Juniper, which told her he had planned ahead, which told her he had thought about this, which made something in her chest do a thing she was not prepared for. She got her hat and went with him. The ride to the Atkins ranch took about 40 minutes north of town, along a trail that ran through grass so tall it brushed her stirrups. The morning was already warm but not brutal, and there was a breeze that moved through the grass in long rolling waves, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that she had begun to think of as a Kansas sky, enormous and uncompromised. He was quiet at first, comfortable in the silence, and she matched him. After a while he began to tell her about the land, not in a formal way but in the way a person talks about something they love without being sure they should say so out loud. He told her where the water ran in dry season and where the grass held best, where he had found good bedrock for the foundation of the house, and why he had built the barn facing south. She listened and asked questions, and his answers grew longer as he realized she was genuinely curious and not just polite. "Why Kansas?" she asked at one point. He considered this. "Because it is not finished yet," he said. "Back east everything has been decided already. Here things are still being figured out. I like being part of the figuring." She thought about that for most of the remaining ride. The ranch was more than she had expected. The house was solid and well made, built from local limestone with a wide porch across the front and real glass in the windows, which was not a given out here. There was a kitchen garden behind it, a little ragged from the recent storms but productive, and a good-sized barn that smelled of hay and horses, and leather in a way she had come to find deeply satisfying. There were several cowhands about, 2 of whom were brothers named Pete and Sam Rojas, and they greeted her with proper courtesy and went back to their work without making anything of her presence. He showed her the house with the manner of someone who was proud of it but aware of its shortcomings. The main room had a stone fireplace, a long oak table, a bookshelf with perhaps 40 books, and a window that faced west across the open range. The books surprised her. She went to the shelf without thinking and began reading the spines. "Dickens," she said, "Thoreau, the complete Shakespeare, Mr. Atkins, you are not what the town led me to expect." "What did the town lead you to expect?" She turned around and found him watching her with something careful and warm in his expression. "Someone efficient," she said, "someone capable, perhaps someone a little formidable. And instead, someone who reads Shakespeare," she said. There was a pause that had weight to it, pleasant weight, the kind you lean into rather than step back from. "My mother sent the books when I built the house," he said. "She said a house without books was just a shelter." "Your mother sounds like an excellent woman." "She was," he said. "She died in '78. Fever." "I am sorry," Ellen said, and meant it with her whole heart. They ate a noon meal on the porch, simple food that one of the hands had prepared, bread and cold beef and sliced tomatoes from the kitchen garden, and they talked for 2 hours without noticing the time passing. He asked about Philadelphia, about the school, about what she had expected when she came west, and how the reality had compared to that expectation. He asked with genuine interest, in the way of a man who had learned to read people carefully and found her worth reading. She told him about the school with a frankness and enthusiasm that she had been keeping somewhat contained around people she did not know well, and he listened with the particular quality of attention that makes the person speaking feel that what they are saying matters. She told him about Cole Harker and geography, and the way the boy's eyes had lit up over a map of the California coast. She did not tell him about Thomas Hale. Not yet. But she felt the ghost of that story becoming smaller, receding to a manageable size somewhere in the back of her mind. They rode back to town in the late afternoon with the sun going sideways and gold across the grass, and at the edge of town he pulled up his horse and turned to her. "I would like to do this again," he said, "if you are willing." She had prepared herself to be cautious, to say something about being busy with the school and not having made any plans beyond getting settled, and instead she heard herself say, "Yes, I would like that too." He nodded, and she thought she saw something ease in him, something he had been holding in reserve. "Next Sunday then," he said, "if the weather holds." "If the weather holds," she agreed. She rode Juniper back to the livery with a composure she had to work to maintain, and it was only when she was alone in her room at the Prairie House that she put her hands over her face and breathed very carefully, because something had opened in her chest that had been closed for a long time, and the openness of it was both wonderful and frightening. She wrote a letter to her brother James in Denver that night. She told him about the school and the students and the prairie sky. She told him about the storm and the creek bank. Toward the end, she wrote a single careful line. "I have met someone who is worth mentioning, and I am taking it one day at a time, which I believe is the correct approach." She sealed the letter and set it aside to mail in the morning, and went asleep feeling something she identified, after a moment's consideration, as hope. The following Sundays became a rhythm, and rhythm became something she looked forward to with an intensity that told her she was in more danger than she had thought. They rode out across the range, sometimes to the ranch, and sometimes just across the open country, and they talked about everything with a growing ease that felt to Ellen like putting on a garment exactly the right size after years of wearing things that fit poorly. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Missouri at the age of 23 with $300 and a horse, and the absolute intention of building something lasting. He had worked for 2 years as a hand on other men's cattle, before buying his first 40 acres. He had been cheated once by a land speculator from Abilene, and had handled it through legal channels rather than the more immediate methods some of his neighbors had suggested, which had cost him more time but let him sleep at night. He had expanded incrementally, patiently, earning every acre. He was 31 years old, and every year of it showed in the best possible way, in the steadiness of him, the groundedness. She also learned that he had a dry humor that emerged sideways, not announced, appearing in unexpected places in conversation like a spring that shows up in the middle of a dry field. She found herself watching for it, and the moments when she caught it and laughed genuinely surprised them both, she thought. He asked her, on the third Sunday, about what had brought her west in the specific way of someone who already suspected there was more to the story but was prepared to wait as long as necessary. They were sitting on a flat limestone outcrop above the creek, having dismounted to let the horses graze. The evening was cooling and there were fireflies beginning in the long grass below them, small cold lights in the dusk. "You are wondering about Philadelphia," she said. "I have been," he said honestly, "but it is your business, not mine." "There was a man," she said. "I thought we had an understanding. We did not. He married someone else." She said it simply, without the bitterness she had expected to feel. "I realized I had been waiting 3 years for a life to begin that was never actually going to happen, so I stopped waiting and started something else instead." "That took courage," he said. "It took anger mostly," she admitted. "The courage came later." He was quiet for a moment. A firefly drifted past between them. "I am glad you were angry," he said quietly. She looked at him. In the fading light his face was serious, and she understood that he meant it in a specific way, that the specific outcome of her specific anger was something he was glad of, and the understanding of that made her heart turn over in her chest in a way that was completely unfair given that she had been so certain she was not ready for any of this. "Nathan," she said, and then stopped, because she had used his first name without planning to, and they both heard it. "Ellen," he said, just as quietly, and the sound of her name in his voice was a thing she felt in her whole body. The evening sat around them in the long blue light of prairie dusk, full of grasshoppers and fireflies and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere north of them, and neither of them moved for a long moment. He reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just quietly, his fingers folding around hers, and she felt the warmth of it go all the way up her arm. They sat like that until the first stars appeared, and then rode back to town side by side through the dark without needing to say anything at all. The town noticed, of course. In a town of 300 people, a man and a woman are noticed in direct proportion to the attention they are paying to each other, and Dusty Creek had been watching this development with the concentrated interest of people who do not have a great deal of competing entertainment. Clara Briggs was pleased in a proprietary way. Herbert Cook mentioned to Ellen that Atkins was the best man he knew in the county, which was his way of giving a blessing she had not asked for, and she thanked him because the sentiment behind it was genuine. There were also, being a real place in a real time, people who were less pleased about it. The Garner brothers that Billy Cook had mentioned back in June were 3 men who ran a neighboring spread to Nathan's and had been encroaching on his eastern fence line for 2 years, testing boundaries in the way of men who mistake patience for weakness. When it became clear that Nathan Atkins was spending his Sundays with the schoolteacher, and the schoolteacher was spending her Sundays on Nathan Atkins's porch, the eldest of the 3, a man named Roy Garner, decided for reasons that had more to do with ego than logic that this was an opportunity to press harder. Ellen heard about this from Nathan one evening when he came to meet her after school let out, which had become a habit. He was usually waiting outside the schoolhouse when the children left, talking to whichever of his hands had ridden into town that day or chatting with Herbert Cook, and they would walk together to the Prairie House or to Clara's kitchen, or just down the street in the long late afternoon light. He told her about the fence trouble calmly, not as someone who was frightened, but as someone who was deciding how to handle a thing methodically. "Roy Garner moved 3 of his cattle across my eastern line and left them there," he said. "When Pete went to move them back, Garner said the line was in the wrong place and he would have a surveyor prove it." "Was there a surveyor?" Ellen asked. "His cousin from Abilene," Nathan said, "who happens to share his opinion on where the line is." "And where is the real line?" 200 yards east of where Garner says it is," Nathan said. "I have the original survey, filed in Wichita in 1876. "Then you have him legally," Ellen said. "I do," he said. "But a man like Roy Garner does not necessarily respond to legal pressure the way you would hope." She looked at him. "What are you planning?" "I have written to the county sheriff in Wichita," he said, "and I have hired a lawyer to file an injunction. I will do this the right way, even though the right way takes longer. Even then," he said. She had the thought, clear and certain, that this was a man she could trust to do the right thing under pressure, not because he was naive about how the world worked, but because he had thought it through and chosen correctly anyway. She had not known many men like that. She had thought Thomas Hale was one of them and had been wrong in a way that had cost her dearly. She did not think she was wrong about Nathan Atkins. She was quite sure of it, in fact, in the way that you are sure of things that have been tested rather than just hoped for. She put her hand on his arm, briefly, walking. He looked down at it and then at her. "It will resolve," she said. "It will," he agreed. It did resolve, though not without drama. Roy Garner came into town one afternoon in August while Nathan was there, and he came in with his brothers and a good deal of noise. He found Nathan at the general store and said things in a loud voice that were designed to be said in front of witnesses, things about the fence line and things about Nathan's character that were untrue and were intended to provoke a response that Roy Garner could use. Ellen was coming down the street from the schoolhouse when it started, and she stopped on the opposite sidewalk and watched with her heart in her throat. Nathan stood in front of Roy Garner and listened to all of it without moving. He let the man say his piece, every word of it. When Roy Garner was done, Nathan said in a level voice that could be heard by every person on that street, "The sheriff's office and my lawyer have both been notified. The injunction was filed Tuesday. Come onto my land again and I will have you arrested. That is everything I have to say to you." Roy Garner's face went red. He wanted a fight and was not getting one and did not know what to do with that. His brothers shifted on their feet. Several townspeople had stopped and were watching. After a moment, Roy Garner spat in the dirt, turned around, and walked to his horse. His brothers followed. They rode out of town and the street exhaled. Nathan turned and saw Ellen across the street. She looked at him steadily. He walked to her. "That is the correct approach," she said. "That was well done." "It was what needed doing," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what makes it well done." He looked at her for a long moment in the late summer heat, and there was something in his face that was open and undisguised, and she held his gaze and did not look away. "Ellen," he said quietly, "I need to say something to you." "All right," she said, equally quietly. "I have been thinking about saying it for some time," he said. "I did not want to say it too soon and make you feel I was not sure of the right time." "You can say it now," she said. He took a breath. "I am in love with you," he said, simply, directly, without embellishment, the way he did everything. "I have been for some time. I am not asking you for anything this moment. I just needed you to know it." Ellen looked at this man standing in the August sun in front of her, this man who had ridden into a hailstorm to find her, who read Shakespeare and built his house facing west and did the right thing even when it was slower and harder, and she felt the last remnant of Thomas Hale dissolve completely, like a piece of paper dropped into water, gone without a trace. "Nathan," she said, "I am in love with you too." He was still for a moment, as if the words needed a moment to land. Then he smiled, and it was the kind of smile she had not seen on him before, full and unguarded, and it changed his face completely, made it younger and warmer and entirely undone. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would very much like to hold your hand right now," he said, "if you will allow it, in the middle of this street in front of all 300 people in this town." "I think that would be entirely appropriate," she said. He took her hand and they stood there in the August afternoon, and Clara Briggs, who had appeared in the door of her establishment with the timing of someone who had been watching from a window, said loudly, "Well, it is about time," and went back inside. What happened next happened with the particular quality of things that have been building for a long time and finally find their level. The courtship that had been conducted in Sunday rides and evening walks and long conversations became openly acknowledged, and the shift felt natural rather than dramatic, like a river finding its channel. He asked her to dinner at the ranch properly, with the table set and the food prepared, and they sat across from each other by lamplight and talked until the candles burned low, and at the end of the evening he stood at the front door of the ranch house and took her hands in both of his and looked at her with those dark, honest eyes. "I want to build something here," he said. "I have been building it alone for a long time. I would rather build it with you, if that is something you want too." "It is something I want," she said. He raised her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she felt that from her fingertips to somewhere deep in her sternum. The Garner trouble resolved in September when the sheriff from Wichita rode out, reviewed the survey documents, and ordered Roy Garner to respect the established boundary line or face charges. Roy Garner, faced with the law in person rather than in letters, chose compliance. The fence held. Nathan went about his business. Ellen continued her school through the fall, and the school grew. 2 new families had arrived in Dusty Creek over the summer, drawn by the railroad expansion that was creeping slowly westward, and they brought 4 new children with them. Ellen arranged the desks to accommodate them and wrote to the educational board in Wichita requesting additional primers, which she received in November, along with a letter complimenting the school's progress that she pinned to the wall behind her desk with a pride she did not bother to conceal. She and Nathan spent every Sunday together without exception. They rode, they read together on the ranch porch. They went to Sunday services and sat in the same pew without anyone remarking on it, because by October it was simply what they did. He taught her to read the Kansas sky properly, pointing out the cloud formations and the wind directions and the particular quality of light that preceded a storm. And she proved a quick student, and the pride in his face when she correctly identified an approaching thunderhead from half a mile and turned them both toward shelter before he had done so was something she kept in the front of her mind like a pressed flower kept in a book. He proposed to her in October. He did it simply, without theater, in the way he did everything. They were sitting on the limestone outcrop above the creek where they had first held hands, and the cottonwood trees along the water were turning yellow in the autumn air, and the light was coming down through the leaves in shifting pieces. He had brought a small ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a single small topaz, and he held it in his palm and said, "Ellen Monroe, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring in his hand and at his face above it, and she thought about the woman who had stepped off a train in June with a broken heart and a carpetbag, and the iron determination never to cry over Thomas Hale again, and she thought about what a very long way she had come from that moment and how glad she was for every mile of it. "Yes," she said. "Nathan Atkins, I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger and it fit, which seemed right. She leaned over and kissed him, there on the limestone with the creek running below them and the cottonwoods golden above them, and he put his arm around her and held her against his side, and they sat like that for a long time with the autumn wind moving through the grass. Clara Briggs cried when Ellen told her. She tried to pretend she was not crying, but she was, and Ellen hugged her tightly and Clara hugged back harder. "I am not crying," Clara said. "Of course not," Ellen said. "I am very happy," Clara said. "I know," Ellen said. "He is a good man," Clara said. "I know that too," Ellen said. "I know it more clearly than I have known anything." They were married in December of 1882 in the Listing Steeple Church, on a day that began cold and gray, and then opened into one of those unexpected winter afternoons on the prairie where the sun comes out, and the sky goes blue as summer, and the snow on the distant bluffs flashes white as salt. Ellen wore a dress she had made with Clara's help from good blue wool that she had ordered from the catalog, and which was the exact color of the Kansas sky on its best days. And she thought her mother would have approved of it, and her father would have said it was impractical, and they both would have been proud. And she let herself feel that fully without it hurting. Nathan wore his best clothes, which were simple and well-made, and he stood at the front of the church with the patience and the quiet steadiness that were so essentially himself. And when she walked up the aisle on Herbert Cook's arm, because Herbert Cook was the closest thing Dusty Creek had to an officiating father figure, and he had offered with such genuine warmth that she had accepted, Nathan looked at her with an expression that was so entirely undefended that she felt it like warmth from a fire. All the way across the church, the ceremony was conducted by Reverend Alston, who had a good plain way with words and did not make the proceedings any longer than they needed to be. When Nathan said, "I do," he said it in the same tone he said everything, clear and certain and with no ornamentation. When she said, "I do," she said it the same way, clear and certain and meaning every syllable. The town turned out for the celebration afterward at the church hall, and there was food from every household and music from 2 fiddles and a guitar played by Pete Rojas, who turned out to have a voice like a cathedral. And Ellen danced with her husband in the church hall with the firelight on his face, and could not believe how simple and complete happiness was when you finally allowed it in. She wrote a letter to James in Denver that night from the ranch, which was now her home, and she told him the whole story from the train platform in June to the dancing in December, and she ended with, "I came west to forget a man, and I found the man I had been looking for all along without knowing I was looking. Tell Martha and the children that Aunt Ellen is very well and very happy, and please come and visit us in the spring." James wrote back that he would, and he was as good as his word. They settled into the life of the ranch with the ease of 2 people who have been waiting, separately and unknowingly, for exactly this. Ellen continued teaching school because she had no intention of giving it up, and Nathan had not suggested she should. He was proud of her work in the way of a man who understood that a person's purpose was something to be honored and not diminished, and he arranged the ranch schedule around school terms without making a production of it, simply adjusting what could be adjusted. She learned the ranch alongside him, not merely as a spectator, but as a genuine participant. She learned to manage the kitchen garden with a seriousness that surprised the Hands, who had expected the schoolteacher to be delicate about dirt. And she learned the rhythms of the cattle work well enough to be useful during calving season, which came in early spring and required everyone on the property to be awake at unreasonable hours. She was not delicate about any of it. The first winter was hard, as first winters in Kansas always were, and the cold was of a quality she had not experienced in Philadelphia, a dry cold that had a character and a weight to it quite different from eastern winters. But the house was solidly built, and the fireplace was good, and Nathan stacked the woodpile with a thoroughness that bordered on the architectural, and she found the prairie winter beautiful in its severity, the way a difficult thing can be beautiful when you are warm and safe inside it. Spring of 1883 came in with a violence, and then a generosity that she was learning to expect of the Kansas seasons. Storms first, and then a soft, warm rain, and then the grass coming up green so bright it almost hurt, and the whole range going sweet-smelling and alive. James came in April with his wife Martha and their 2 children, a boy named William who was 8 and a girl named Ruth who was 5. And Ellen had the ranch porch and the kitchen full of family for the first time, and felt a fullness in her that she had not known she was missing. James took one look at Nathan Atkins and then at his sister, and then he shook Nathan's hand with both of his and said, "Well done," which encompassed, Ellen thought, a great deal more than the ranch and the crops. Martha was small and quick and practical, and liked Nathan on the basis of the way he listened to people, which she said in 48 hours of observation was the quality she most respected in a man. The children went wild over Biscuit the mare and the ranch dogs and the new calves, and Billy Cook, who had become something of a fixture around the ranch, appointed himself their unofficial guide with great ceremony. James told Ellen quietly on the last evening before he went back to Denver that she looked different from the woman who had turned up in Philadelphia on the day of Thomas Hale's wedding announcement. He said she looked settled and sure of herself and genuinely happy, and he said it with the particular relief of an older brother who had spent months worrying at a distance. "I am," Ellen said. "I am genuinely happy." "You know," James said, "I always thought you were too good for Hale." "You never said so," Ellen said. "You would not have believed me," he said. "You needed to find it out yourself. You did, and you landed here, and I could not be more pleased about it." She hugged her brother hard on the porch in the April morning, with the grass going green in every direction and Nathan visible across the yard, talking to Pete Rojas about the spring fence work, turning once to look at her and lifting a hand, and she lifted a hand back, and felt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The summer of 1883 was good for the ranch. The cattle prices held, and Nathan was able to buy an additional 60 acres on the northwest edge of his property, rounding out the boundary in a way that had bothered him for 2 years. And he came home from the filing office in such fine spirits that he lifted her off her feet in the front yard, and she laughed out loud in a way she rarely did, uninhibited and full, and the ranch dogs came running to investigate the noise. She told him she was expecting their first child in August, in the kitchen after supper, and she watched the news travel across his face. First surprise, then a wondering kind of stillness, then something that was completely undone, a joy too large for his face to hold quietly, and he stood up from the table and came around it and held her with such careful, shaking tenderness that she felt tears run down her face which she had not expected. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I am more than all right," she said. "I am crying because I am happy, which is very inconvenient." "Cry as much as you like," he said, and held on. Clara Briggs, upon being told, wept openly and without apology, which was considerably more efficient. The school had a good teacher to take over when Ellen reduced her hours in the late fall, a young woman named Agnes Price, who had come west from St. Louis, and had the same lean practical intelligence that the frontier seemed to produce in the women who came to it with their eyes open. Ellen kept 2 half-days a week, sitting in the back of the room rather than teaching, which was harder than it sounded because she had opinions about the proper introduction of long division, but she managed. The child was born in March of 1884, and he was a boy, and they named him William James Atkins after Ellen's brother, which made James cry when he received the letter, which was the first time Ellen had ever known her brother to cry about anything, and which she recorded in her journal as a notable event. The baby was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark eyes from the first week, and Nathan held him with the same careful attention he brought to everything, studying the child's face with a seriousness that Ellen found entirely endearing. "He looks like you," she told Nathan on the second day. "He looks like a very small person who is very angry about being in the world," Nathan said. "I find that I like him tremendously." "That is because he is already sensible," Ellen said. "Life moved forward with the quality of things that are genuinely good, not perfect, because nothing is perfect, but deeply, solidly good. There were hard seasons and good ones. There was the drought of the mid-'80s that hit every rancher in the county, and required the kind of patience and resourcefulness that tested marriages and households, and Nathan's approach to it, methodical and steady, and refusing to panic when others around him were panicking, was something Ellen found herself leaning on in a way she had not expected to lean on anyone. The Roy Garner trouble came around once more in the summer of 1884, because men like Roy Garner tend to circle back. But this time it resolved more quickly because Nathan's reputation in the county was now solidly established, and the sheriff from Wichita had a long memory for people who required his attention more than once. Roy Garner sold his spread the following year and moved west, and Nathan's eastern fence line was thereafter uncontested, which pleased him in a permanent and uncomplicated way. Ellen's school had grown enough by 1885 that the single room was crowded, and she wrote a proposal to the town alderman outlining the case for a second schoolroom and a second teacher, making the argument in terms of the town's growing population and the practical necessity of separating the younger children from the older ones, so both groups could advance at the proper rate. The proposal was approved, and the building was underway by October, and she supervised the construction with the involvement of someone who had strong feelings about window placement and was not shy about expressing them. Clara Briggs was present for most of this, leaning in the doorway of the new building with a coffee cup, commenting on the window situation with authority. "You are going to terrify those builders," Clara said. "Good," said Ellen. "The last window was 8 inches too low." Clara laughed her big rolling laugh that Ellen had come to love like a familiar piece of music. Their daughter came in the spring of 1886, and they named her Clara after the woman who had given Ellen cornbread and a push in the right direction at the moment she needed both. And Clara Briggs cried so hard when she heard that she had to sit down. And then she held the baby with the fierce, gentle competence of a woman who has loved children all her life and regretted none of it. And the baby gripped her finger with that extraordinary certainty that newborns have. And Clara looked at Ellen over the baby's head with eyes that were very bright. "You named her for me," Clara said. "I did," Ellen said. "She will know exactly who she was named for and exactly why." "Well," said Clara, with great dignity, and then ruined the dignity entirely by pressing her cheek to the baby's head and staying like that for a long time. Nathan with the baby Clara was the same as Nathan with everything, steady and careful, and entirely in love. Ellen watched him carry the baby in the crook of his arm across the ranch yard in the spring evening, the baby making small sounds and Nathan talking to her in a low voice, pointing out the horses and the barn and the green distance of the range, and she thought that she would like to hold that image in her mind for the rest of her life. That man in the spring evening with their daughter against his chest. She was teaching again, fully, by the fall of 1886, with a proper schedule and Agnes Price handling the younger children in the new schoolroom. The school had by this time 37 students, which represented most of the children in the county, and Ellen had developed a reputation that reached well beyond Dusty Creek. She had been written about in the Wichita Eagle in a small article about frontier education, which Herbert Cook had framed and hung in his office, which embarrassed her when she saw it and pleased her when he was not looking. Billy Cook, now 15 and growing at an alarming rate, had developed the reading habit to the point where he arrived at the schoolhouse after hours sometimes to borrow books and discuss them, which Nathan found funny and Ellen found entirely gratifying. "He will go to university," she told Nathan one evening. "Does he know that?" Nathan asked. "Not yet," she said. "I am working on it." Nathan looked at her in the lamplight with that expression she had come to know and love, the one that was both fond and entirely convinced, and he shook his head a little. "You are going to change this town," he said. "It is already changing," she said. "I am just paying attention." The year 1887 brought several things. It brought a second good cattle season. It brought a new family of settlers named Caraway who built a farm on the southern edge of town, and included a woman, Anna Caraway, who became Ellen's third close friend after Clara and Martha. It brought little William his first day at school, which he approached with the gravity of someone undertaking an important mission, his father's seriousness already visible in him at 3 years and some months, which made his teacher, Miss Price, send a note home saying he was the most focused student she had ever encountered at his age, which made Nathan quietly proud and Ellen rather amused. It also brought, in November, a letter from Philadelphia. The letter was from an old acquaintance named Dorothy Marsh, a woman Ellen had known slightly in her Philadelphia years, and the letter contained, buried in its third paragraph beneath a great deal of news about various people Ellen had largely forgotten, the information that Thomas Hale had divorced his Boston banker's daughter in 1885 after a marriage that had been, according to the comprehensive social reporting of Dorothy Marsh, thoroughly unhappy from the beginning. Ellen read the letter twice at the kitchen table in the morning light, with William eating his porridge beside her and baby Clara making architectural decisions about her oatmeal, and Nathan across the table reading a letter from his supplier in Wichita. She folded Dorothy Marsh's letter and set it down. Nathan looked up. He could read her face with great accuracy at this point, and he looked at the letter and back at her and waited. "It is from an old acquaintance in Philadelphia," she said. "She tells me that Thomas Hale's marriage ended badly." A silence. William put another spoonful of porridge in his mouth with the concentration of a small person performing an important task. "How do you feel about that?" Nathan asked. Ellen considered the question honestly, which was always her way. She looked at her son with his father's dark eyes and her daughter with her hair working its way out of its ribbon again, and this kitchen in this house on this range in the morning light, and she looked at her husband across the table, steady and present in hers. "I feel nothing about it at all," she said, "which surprises me a little and then does not surprise me at all." "Good," he said. "It is good, isn't it?" she said. "I came all this way to forget a man. I have thoroughly succeeded." "You did more than that," he said. "I did," she agreed. "Rather a great deal more." She folded Dorothy Marsh's letter once more and set it on the pile of letters to be answered, where it would eventually get a polite and pleasant reply that said nothing much about the Thomas Hale information because it was not worth saying anything about, and she turned back to her coffee and her children and her mourning. Life on the ranch and in the town continued to grow and deepen. The cattle operation expanded, and Nathan hired 2 additional hands in the spring of 1888, young men from a family called Vega who had come up from Texas and knew cattle the way they knew their own names. And they proved their worth in the first season and settled into the rhythm of the place without friction. Ellen's new schoolroom was functioning well, and she had by now a waiting list of letters from young women in eastern cities who had heard about the Dusty Creek School and wanted to come west to teach, which was a thing she had not anticipated but found deeply satisfying. She wrote careful, honest letters back telling them the truth about what they could expect, which she had wished someone had told her, and 3 of them came, and 2 of them stayed and built good lives, and she felt the ripple of that outward in a way she could not entirely quantify but knew was real. It was Clara Briggs who told her in the summer of 1888 that she was thinking of selling the Prairie House. Ellen set down her coffee cup. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Nowhere," Clara said serenely. "I intend to stay in this town until I die, which will not be soon because I am constitutionally stubborn. I am selling the hotel because it is too much work for one woman and I have saved enough to live comfortably, and what I want to do with the next 10 years of my life is less of the hotel business and more of the everything else." "What is the everything else?" Ellen asked. Clara fixed her with a look. "I thought I might help you with the school," she said, "not as a teacher. As someone who makes sure the children are fed and that the heat works and that you do not work yourself to death, which is what you do when no one is watching." Ellen looked at this woman across the table, this woman who had given her cornbread and a push and a friendship that had turned out to be one of the most important relationships in her life, and she said, "I would like that very much." The Prairie House was sold to a young man from Ohio named Fletcher who intended to expand it, which he did, and Clara moved into a small house 3 doors down from the schoolhouse and became what she had said she would become, an indispensable presence in the life of the school and the life of the Monroe Atkins household, which she managed to be part of approximately 5 evenings a week without anyone feeling that this was excessive. The children adored her. William, who had his father's seriousness, relaxed completely around Clara in the way that serious children relax around people who do not require them to perform, and baby Clara, who had her mother's directness, called her "my Clara" from the time she could make the distinction, which delighted the woman beyond all expression. In the fall of 1888, Nathan came home from a cattle drive to Wichita with a book he had found in a shop there, a new novel he had noticed because it was sitting on the shelf spine out in a way that reminded him of how Ellen arranged books. He walked in the front door and handed it to her without preamble. "The bookseller said it was very good," he said. She looked at the title. It was a novel she had been wanting to read since she had seen it mentioned in a month-old copy of a literary newspaper from New York. "How did you know I wanted this?" she asked. "You mentioned it in April," he said, pulling off his trail coat, "when we were talking about the catalog order." She stood in the kitchen holding the book, looking at this man who had ridden to Wichita and back on a cattle drive, and come home through the November cold carrying a book he had remembered her mentioning 7 months ago. And she thought, as she had thought many times and would think many more, that she had come west to forget a man, and the man she had found had made her glad she came in ways she could not have imagined or anticipated or invented. She went to him and kissed him properly, right there in the kitchen with the supper on the stove, and he laughed a little against her mouth, surprised and pleased, and held her with his cold coat still on. "I am glad you came west," he said. "So am I," she said. "More than I can tell you. Every day more than I can tell you." The years that followed had the quality of a life fully lived, all 4 seasons of it, the beautiful and the difficult and the daily and the exceptional all woven together into something she would later think of as the truest kind of richness. There was the hard winter of 1889 that tested every household in the county and required the community to share resources and support one another in ways that deepened the bonds between neighbors who had already been neighbors for years. There was the birth of their 3rd child, another boy, born in May of 1890 and named Thomas, not after Thomas Hale, as Nathan understood with the precision of a man who paid attention, but after Nathan's own father, Thomas Atkins, who had died of pneumonia in Missouri before Nathan had ever come west. Little Thomas was from the first day the easiest of the 3 children, sunny and accommodating in a way that made Ellen and Nathan exchange glances of fond bewilderment, as if they could not account for where he had come from. William remained the serious one, precise and thoughtful, already in 1890 at 6 years old, showing the early signs of the mind that would, Ellen was certain, take him places. Clara at 4 was a force of nature, strong-willed and joyful and absolutely certain of her own opinions, which delighted her father and occasionally required her mother to deploy considerable authority. Billy Cook did go to university. He went to the University of Kansas in Lawrence in 1889, which Ellen had arranged through a combination of correspondence with the institution and absolutely relentless advocacy with the Cook family and the county educational board. He came back to visit the following summer, taller and different in the way of people encountering the world on its own terms for the first time, and he sat on the Atkins ranch porch and talked to Ellen and Nathan for 4 hours about everything he had learned and seen, and his eyes when he talked about the future were exactly the eyes she had seen years before when Cole Harker had discovered the California coast on a classroom map, hungry and awake and pointed forward. "Thank you, Mrs. Atkins," he said before he left. "Go make something of it," she said. "That is all the thanks I need." He did. He became a lawyer eventually, which was fitting. The spring of 1891 brought James and Martha out again for a long visit, their children now grown to be 16 and 13, and William, who was their eldest, had the sharp interest of a boy on the edge of becoming something more than a boy, and he and Ellen's William spent 3 days in intense companionship that included a great deal of discussion of horses and history, and what the West was going to look like in 20 years. James and Nathan had by this point the easy friendship of men who have had years to establish themselves in each other's regard, and they could be found most evenings on the porch with the day's work done, talking about land prices and cattle markets and local politics, and the general question of where the country was heading, which was a conversation that could be resumed from any point because it never really concluded. Martha and Ellen sat in the kitchen one evening while the men were on the porch and the children were audible somewhere in the yard, and Martha looked at her sister-in-law with the directness she had always shown and said, "You are happy." "I am," Ellen said. "Not as a thing you have settled for," Martha said. "Happy in the way of someone who got exactly what they needed." "Exactly," Ellen said. "I am happy in the way of someone who got exactly what they needed, which happens to be considerably better than what I thought I wanted." "Thomas Hale," Martha said. "Thomas Hale," Ellen agreed, and they both felt the name fall into the kitchen and land with no weight at all, just a sound, just history, just the name of a road not taken that had led somewhere else and arrived here, which was exactly right. "I never liked him," Martha said. "Nobody did," Ellen said. "I was the last to know." "You were not the last," Martha said kindly. "You were just the one who had to find it out the hard way. Some lessons are only available that way." "The best ones," Ellen said, and meant it. The summer of 1891 was extraordinary on the ranch. The cattle did well and the weather was cooperative, and the kitchen garden produced tomatoes of such quality that Ellen canned enough of them to last through 3 winters. Clara Briggs, now past 60 and still constitutionally stubborn as promised, spent 3 days helping with the canning and produced a headache in everyone within earshot through the force of her opinions about the proper method, and they all loved her fiercely for it. Nathan, at the end of that summer, on an evening in late August that was cooling slowly toward the fall, sat on the porch beside Ellen after the children were in bed, and the ranch was quiet except for the insects in the grass and the distant sound of cattle and the occasional communication from the barn, and he looked out at the range going dark in the dusk. "I was thinking today," he said, "about the day you came out of the general store with the chalk and the map." "I remember," she said. "I held the door," he said. "You did," she said. "I thought," he said, "that you were the most interesting person I had seen in this town in 6 years. I had no idea what to do with that." "You did well enough," she said. "I went home that evening," he said, "and I sat in this exact chair and thought about how a person goes about getting to know someone they have only said 2 words to. And what did you conclude?" "I concluded that the direct approach was probably wrong," he said, "that it required something more like patience. So I waited." "You waited," she said. "And then the storm came," he said, "and I rode out because Charlie at the livery had said you went riding east, and I thought someone should check. And I found you on Biscuit in the middle of a hailstorm looking at the sky like you were trying to have an argument with it." She laughed. "I was trying to understand it. I know," he said, "that was what I liked about it." They sat in the dusk with the prairie going dark around them. This man and this woman who had met through a held door and a hailstorm and Sunday rides and limestone outcroppings and conversations that went on until the stars came out. This man who had read Shakespeare and remembered books she had mentioned and done the right thing even when it was slower. This woman who had come west in anger and found something she had not known to look for. "Nathan," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that there is not a single day I have been here that I have not been glad I came." He turned and looked at her. "Not one day. Not one," she said, "including the hard ones, including the drought year, including the garner trouble and the hard winter and the canning arguments with Clara. Every single day I have been glad." He reached over and took her hand in the dark, the way he had first done it on that limestone outcrop in the firefly summer, easy and certain, and she felt the warmth of it the same way she always had, from her fingers to somewhere deep in her chest. "Good," he said. "Yes," she said, "very good." The stars came out above the Kansas range one by one, and the night wind moved through the grass, and inside the house 3 children slept the deep sleep of children who are safe. And in the barn the horses stood in their stalls, and the dog lay across the porch steps, and the whole ranch was held in the particular quiet of a place that is genuinely at peace with itself. Ellen Monroe had come west to forget a man. She had walked off a train in June of 1882 with a broken heart and an iron will, and she had taught school and learned the sky and held her ground through storms of several kinds. And she had found, in this spare and extraordinary place, a man who held doors and remembered books and rode into hailstorms and did the right thing and knew exactly how to hold a frightened horse. And she had loved him and built a life with him that was solid and wide and full of the particular warmth of things made together with care. She had come west to forget a man. The man she had found had made her glad she did. Not in the way of a consolation prize, not in the way of settling for what was available, but in the way of something that exceeds the original intention so completely that the original intention comes to seem, in retrospect, like the necessary beginning of the real story. She sat on the porch with his hand in hers and the stars above the Kansas range multiplying in the August dark, and she felt whole and settled and deeply, permanently glad. And she thought that this, precisely this, was what it meant to have found the right life, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of someone who made the difficulty worth moving through, and who was still there when you came out the other side, steady as limestone, warm as the kitchen fire, hers. The night deepened around them. The grass moved, the stars held. They stayed on the porch a long time, not saying much, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already said in the way his thumb moved across the back of her hand, in the way she turned her face toward him in the dark, in the shape of the house behind them and the ranch around them, and the 3 sleeping children inside. When they finally went in, the door closed quietly behind them, and the porch was empty, and the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, and the ranch lay quiet and whole under it all, as solid and lasting as everything Nathan Atkins had ever built, as everything they had built together, as everything they would go on building in all the years that still lay ahead of them, stretching out like the range itself, wide and green and full of possibility, going all the way to the horizon and beyond.